Consider this. A boy is born in Washington, D.C. during the height of World War II. You might say he was born into diplomacy. He grows up and joins the U.S. Army, serving in Vietnam, soon after his father is appointed U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. When he leaves the Army, he also becomes a U.S. ambassador to Bahrain, Algeria, and Afghanistan as well. What can he teach us about U.S. foreign policy? Quite a lot, if you're willing to stick around, and we hope you will. I'm Yvonne Greer, and my guest is retired U.S. Ambassador Ronald Newman, next on Consider This. I must admit, I was both excited and nervous when they told me I was going to have an opportunity to have a conversation on the air with a retired U.S. ambassador. The term ambassador is so large and the foreign policy concept is so large, I wasn't quite sure I could do it justice. But now in just a few minutes off the air, speaking with Ambassador Newman, it has been just refreshing. So welcome to Consider This.
Thank you. When you said that about ambassadors, it reminded me of an old joke that said old diplomats don't die, they just look that stiff.
That's a good one.
We'll try not to do that.
So take me back, if you will, to your household growing up. Was this notion of diplomacy sort of first and foremost in your household growing up, with your father being a diplomat?
Well, when I was growing up, my father was actually teaching at UCLA as a professor. He had come as an immigrant from Austria after spending a little time in concentration camp, joined the Army, and by the time he got his citizenship, he was too old, because in those days we had a cutoff and he couldn't join the Foreign Service, our diplomatic service. He would have if he could have. And so he was a professor for years, then finally was appointed under Johnson, but retained under Nixon in Afghanistan. And that was about the time I passed the Foreign Service exam. And so we used to joke that we'd come in the Foreign Service close together, he at the top and I at the bottom.
Nice family joke.
But when I was growing up, because he was teaching political science, there were a lot of foreigners and sometimes American diplomats and others coming through the house. And somehow that ignited some spark, and I decided the Foreign Service was what I wanted to do.
Now, if you ask the average person about Foreign Service, the State Department, diplomacy, I believe notions would come up like, oh, I was watching this movie and they said, you just need to get to the U.S. Embassy and you'll be okay, or you had diplomatic immunity. Our terms tend to be so nebulous amongst the American people. How would you define diplomacy to the average person you just met at a dinner party?
First and foremost, it is trying to get foreigners to do things we want in ways that help our national interest. And then it has a lot of subparts: pushing commerce. We do a lot to sell American products overseas. Health and welfare of Americans. You know, if you're in trouble overseas, yes, you do go to an embassy. If you're in jail, well, we can't get you out of jail, but we'll get you a lawyer. And then when you have crises, you know, if it's the earthquake in Haiti, it's the embassy that's finding out who's alive and who's dead and getting word back. And if it's an evacuation, a lot of times people will see the military come in and do the evacuation. They think this is a military operation. It's this embassy that organizes it. It's the embassy that finds the Americans, and often it's the embassy that will remain after everybody else is gone. It's, in a way, it's the last 3 feet of intelligence. It's the knowledge of local countries that gives you the basis for making intelligent decisions if your policy makers want to listen to you.
You are here in Peoria, and we're welcoming you here as part of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council and our Riverfront Museum, hosting a documentary called America's Diplomats. Tell me about that documentary. It
was a documentary made for PBS. A lot of my friends are in it, full confession, I'm in it too. And it's a 54-minute exploration of what we do, also about a lot of embassy bombings and terrorist attacks and what we put up with. A lot of people have this kind of striped pants cookie pusher notion, but I think we've had, 181 diplomats dying overseas, mostly violently, since World War II, including a number of ambassadors. That didn't start with Chris Stevens. You know, people think of it as a kind of quiet hiding profession. I've been mortared and shot at and one thing and another in my career, not daily business, but I think one of the things to remember is war is an extension of politics. You go to war for political means, purposes. At the end, you have to construct something politically that gives you stability after the war. And often that's the task of the diplomats. It's not the task of the soldiers. And often you have to be doing it in the middle of the war in order to get the end state right. We tend to separate these things. I think that's very artificial. But
so you're very intricately interwoven in not only the political process, but the war process, and then the restructuring and strategic initiatives afterwards.
There are no lanes or separation anymore. In the kind of wars we've been in, you just can't do that. And so when I was in Afghanistan, and the American Force Commander, then with General Eikenberry, we would get together once a week and have this long dinner with our mutual checklist. And I understood that he had every reason to be concerned about how we were going to do things in justice or economic development, because if those things didn't work, we weren't going to have the conditions that would allow victory, allow him to go home. And he understood that I had every reason to be concerned about operational issues on the military side, because they would bounce back into politics and into local support for the government, things like that. And so he accepted that. You know, in the end of the day, the decisions about the aid programs, say, those were mine. And the decisions about the troop movements, those were his. But we both had an interchange about them because we were each affected by them.
What insights can you offer the American public about the state of affairs in Afghanistan currently? I know you're retired from your post as ambassador.
Yeah, but I go back every year, actually.
You do?
Yeah, I've been back a dozen times since I retired. I was back last year, and I'll be back next month.
And what brings you back? What takes you back?
Well, because I keep writing and speaking about Afghanistan, and so I feel a requirement to keep myself reasonably up to date. I have a horror of people who sound very authoritative and have gone out of date on a subject.
Got it. So what is the state? There are what, 16 years now
we've been at
there?
it 16 years, although that becomes kind of a bumper sticker for a lack of thought, because a lot of things that are going wrong we haven't been doing for 16 years. We didn't start building a big army till the Obama decisions of 2009, didn't fund them until 2010, and quit doing a lot of them by 2014. So many things that are problems in the military side, for one thing, we've only been at it a few years. We didn't do a very good job. We never, except for one limited period, we never got over 50% of our training teams fielded in Afghanistan. As it is, they've lost a lot of people. They've lost more fatalities last year than we had all 15, 16 years in Afghanistan. And they're still fighting. They're still in the field. So it's not hopeless, but it is a bad situation.
So we keep hearing, we want our troops home, we want our troops home. Are we any closer to creating a process by which that's going to happen in the near future?
No. Well, you can always bug out, and then, you know, it's really hard to quit wars unilaterally if the other side thinks you're still at war. And so now you've got Al-Qaeda is still there, allied with the Taliban, and now you have the Islamic State building up in Afghanistan. Now they fight with each other, but I don't know that you want to subcontract your war with the Islamic State to an organization allied with Al-Qaeda. That's the one that struck us in New York. So there are real downsides to leaving. I think, first of all, getting everybody out is very hard. Getting it down to a situation where we have fewer casualties in Afghanistan every year than we probably lose for drunk driving in our military off hours in the States, that's not hard. We've had total, I think, of, you know, we're now June, we're halfway in the year, we've had 6 people killed. This is not a huge battle going on. It's costing us money, it's not a huge battle. I think what we do need to do, we need to do several things, they need to be interrelated. We do need to increase the troops slightly, but not combat troops so much. We need to finish the proper advising and building job that we left half done when we ran out too quickly. We need to hold the Afghans accountable for much better leadership at the military level. They're senior people. There's too much politics is undercutting the ability of the force, even though they're good people lower down.
So are they relying on U.S. and NATO to come in and handle this job for them? What are our relationships like with the Afghan people?
Complex. Afghanistan's a place where I'm not sure anybody understands it, but I can raise your confusion to a higher level of detail. But at the fighting level, no, they're doing a lot of fighting, a lot of casualties, and they're not falling apart. And their commandos that our special forces have advised are first class. But at the upper level, there's too much politics in the selection of commanders, preserving forces for political purposes and not doing the job. And that's hard to get around because they're also the people that provide political support for parties and things. So we're going to have to take a stronger line in that. Third thing that I think is absolutely essential is if we're going to stay, then we have to be clear that's what we're doing. Because when that affects how everybody around Iran, Pakistan, Russia organizes themselves, what they do. If you're not clear, they assume the worst, they play around. Right now, because it hasn't been clear for the last year practically what was going on, you're seeing the Russians helping out the Taliban. You're seeing the Iranians who've been killed by the Taliban beginning to make overtures to them because they're worried about the Islamic State.
I would imagine that would also affect trust just amongst Afghanistan leaders because they don't know if we're staying or not.
Huge. And it undercuts everything you're trying to do. So if you're going to put in more troops, if you're going to keep money, if you're going to try to push the Afghans, as I think you should, for better leadership, you have to be clear that we're reliable. If you're not clear that we're reliable, but you want them to save us, they're going to be busy saving themselves.
So how do we move forward? How do we get to a point where we can start to bring some U.S. troops home and then stabilize the region so that they can manage their own government?
Dual process. One, building up and increasing the professionalism of the force, which we could have done a better job of to begin with. And secondly, working on with them as much as on them. And President Ghani, I think, wants this, a measure of reform so that it begins to build Afghan support for their own government, which there is a certain amount of. The Taliban are not particularly popular by any measure of public opinion surveys. That they don't have some huge reservoir of people, but people doubt the government. And I think those are the two long-term steps. And then there's some things, we need to build an air force, but once their air force comes into being, then you don't need as much air combat as you've got. Once they enlarge their special forces, you don't need as much of our special forces there. And the rest is mostly logistics and training and things that aren't combat roles. So you might have a force there. We have, 30,000 people in Korea, and that war ended in the 50s. But it doesn't particularly bother us. We're not losing any people in Korea, except for an occasional icy road accident. So I think you need to think of it as being something that may look a lot more like Korea, more violence out in the countryside maybe than Korea has, but not U.S. troops being in the middle of a war all the time.
And perhaps it's that we get so much information about Afghanistan and so little information about Korea, maybe because there aren't the number of casualties, there's not that Taliban force that's out there that's prevalent in people's minds. How is the U.S. perceived by other nations around the world? We have a new presidency, we have some unrest in our own congressional house. How is that affecting our impressions at NATO and in other embassies around the world?
I think there's what we're seeing is profound uncertainty about what we're doing, so that you have disconnects between what the president says and what the Secretary of State says and what the Secretary of Defense says, and when you have those disconnects, then others don't know whether they can rely on us or not. And that isn't so much about pressing people to pay more, which I think is perfectly reasonable, but it's about, at the end of the day, are you paying because you're a partner in this, or are you paying for a service that might not be delivered? Because a lot of things like NATO is about deterrence. And deterrence isn't really, at the end of the day, about war fighting. It's about not fighting. It's about having your enemy believe that you will fight, so you don't start a war. If you put that in doubt, you risk miscalculation from your enemies. You risk your friends making deals out of weakness because they're not sure you've got their back. And so it's a corrupting force over time. I don't think we're there yet. Right now you've just got a lot of unease, but the administration has changed so many positions from the campaign to now, which isn't a whole lot of time, that on one hand, from my point of view, Washington bubble perspective, those are good changes, but you don't quite know where the ship's going.
You lose a little bit of continuity, if you will.
Yeah.
So how does that affect diplomacy and what you call, what was it, the last 3 feet?
Well, one of the things that I'm concerned about is that we're going to grossly underfund diplomacy. I think the current budget proposal, which has 30% cut for the State Department, is absurdly bad. And I would call to witness to support of that some pretty strong Republican voices like Leslie Graham and Senator Corker, who runs the Foreign Affairs Committee, who said that he quit reading the budget because it was so unrealistic from anything the Congress was going to pass that it wasn't worth his attention. Senator Graham was scathing with poor Secretary Tillerson the other day. And I think what people need to understand is, what do we do? What do you need your diplomats to do? One is you need local knowledge. When I mentioned it in an article, when you have a crisis, it's the diplomats who are on the ground that you need to tell you who to back and who not to back and how not to do something stupid. The journalists often aren't there, and the academics are writing papers that may be very good and will be published a year later.
But so right here, right now,
right here,
you need
right
the
now.
diplomat.
So one of the things you need is you need your diplomats on the ground. And you need them to get out. One of the things that happened after Benghazi is that Washington got really scared, but it's transferred from one administration to the next. So we're keeping people too bottled up. And we have to, there are ways to operate not without some risk, but I spent 16 months in Baghdad too, in between, before I went to Afghanistan for my reward. And Robert Ford, who later became ambassador in Syria and other things, and I did a lot of our meetings in the red zone. And we did a lot of them in hotels, for instance, where we could go, but we didn't have to have quite as much security right around us, and Iraqis could come and they could talk to us without being marked as seeing the Americans, because a lot of Iraqis were going in and out of the hotels and things. Mm-hmm. So you find ways to do these things, but you have to let your people get out and do them. And so it makes no sense. We have a number of UN operations. They want to cut the funding for that. Well, there's a couple of things you need to know about UN peacekeeping. One, you have no UN peacekeeping operations that we don't approve of, because they all have to be done by the Security Council. We have a veto. We have them in places where we don't really want to send American troops. They cost 1/8 of what it costs to field American troops. Mm-hmm. So you're sending them to places where you want something done at 1/8 the cost of U.S. troops, and who are going to be mobilized sometimes for a long time. And it's all with our permission, and not just with our permission, but it meets our policy goals. Why do you want to cut that? It makes no sense.
What can the average American do? What is our job as a U.S. citizen in terms of foreign policy relations? Is it just about keeping ourselves informed? Is it about using our voice during election times? What role do we serve when the concepts are so broad and so far-reaching?
That is such a good question and such a hard question to answer, because you can't ask everybody to take out of their daily life and become a foreign policy expert. I mean, that's absurd. I think you can ask people when there are big issues and people are arguing about them, at least dig into them a little bit. Don't just go with the bumper sticker conversation. Insofar as people are talking to their congressional representatives, then making it clear that they share the belief of General Mattis and Senator Graham and plenty of others that diplomacy is important and should be properly funded, and support that view. I think that's tremendously important. Other things fall below the public horizon. I'm concerned right now that we keep recruitment going in the Foreign Service. I don't think people know much about the Foreign Service, and I don't know how much they want to know, but it's a career it is like the military. You take the same oath to the Constitution. You're worldwide available. It's actually, the personnel system's patterned on the Navy. It's up or out promotion. You have to be promoted at a certain rate, or you're at. It's not like the civil service where you're hired for a job. Your rank is in your person. Just like if you're in the military, if you're a captain, you go from one job to the next job. Whatever the job is, you're still a captain,
okay,
right? Unless they promote you. So that's the same with the Foreign Service, and it serves in some fairly tough places, and it serves in some good places. And its job is not laying over for foreigners. Its job is persuading foreigners to do things that we want them to do.
So what type of traits must one have in order to be an effective forest serviceman or woman?
One is good listening, because, you know, a large part of persuading other people to do something is hearing what their interest is, what their case is, what you can't persuade them to, where there's room to move them, how you structure the deal. It's not about not delivering the message. My favorite slogan about diplomacy is, it's about telling somebody to go to hell in such a way that they look forward to the trip. But it's not about not delivering the message. It's about how you deliver the message.
So would attorneys make good diplomats?
They might. We have a number of Foreign Service officers I've known over time. There's a fair percentage of attorneys who've gone in. I think they decided they wanted to work on something that was of larger national value than what they were doing as attorneys. So anyway, good ability to listen, ability to write, obviously. Short, speak well.
What about courage and tenacity? You mentioned that you've experienced mortar fire yourself. I'm guessing lots and lots of threats over the years. There are some people who are now afraid to go to certain public venues because they're afraid that there's going to be some sort of attack based on other situations we've seen here in the U.S. and around the world. And how do you take that next step of courage and say, I'm going in harm's way deliberately for the sake of peace and policy and country?
Yeah. Well, that's harder to answer without sounding like you're bragging.
Well, I would imagine there's a lot of chutzpah that must go into wanting that job.
Well, I mean, some of it is the sense of duty. I think sense of duty is important. We're an awful lot about rights these days, and we're not too much about obligations in our public discourse in general. But part of it's about duty. But part of it is also how you do things sensibly. So, you know, there's a lot of things you can do in areas that are somewhat dangerous, but there's sensible ways to do it that minimize the risk. You can't completely eliminate risk. And people who want all diplomats safe all the time, it's like the librarian who's only happy if all the books are on the shelf. Oh, you know, the books are safe, but nobody's getting any use out of the library. So if you're keeping everybody so penned up that they can't take any risk. But then it gets to be a question of understanding the local situation, of a lot of detail of what is safe to do, and not just kind of knee-jerk reactions to security. And people will do things that don't make sense. For, you know, if somebody says it's security, you can do some really stupid stuff. Remember, after 9/11, there was a rule about you can't take any suitcases in the, you couldn't check them at the curb. You know, when you thought about that rule, all bombs have to be taken inside the terminal for detonation. I mean, it made no sense at all. But somebody said security, everybody's doing it. So a lot of it is looking very closely. I don't think I take foolish chances. Although once in Iraq, I went someplace and I had to go see a military commander, and he was blocked from coming to me, and I had to get my security detail to take us out where I wanted to go in a Spanish armored vehicle. And my Blackwater guy said, "Do we really have to do this?" And I said, we did, but I mean, there were very particular reasons why I had to go see that guy. But I said, you know, I did promise my wife I wouldn't do anything crazy. And he said, "Oh, sir, we're way beyond that."
And speaking of your wife, I should say that you are married and you have 2 children. If I may ask personally, how has diplomacy worked in your own life at home?
I think quite well. I had made up my mind to go in the Foreign Service before I proposed, and I told her everything that could go wrong, because I didn't think she could be a martyr for years and years, and she said it's never been as bad as what I suggested. I think it's brought us close together as a family. in many cases. At least when you move overseas, you're dealing with a new situation, new culture, but a lot of it you're dealing with together. I mean, I might go off to the office and she might be dealing with the staff at home, or the kids might be going to school, but there's a lot of the cultural stuff that you're all dealing with together. I think that may bring you closer together when you're overseas, even though you're moving around. And we've been lucky, we didn't get evacuated. We went through most of my career without being separated, and then we had 6 years of separation in the last 12 years of the service because of the places that I got asked to go.
Well, you're still together, so you guys must be doing something right.
We're still together. We just celebrated 50th a couple years ago.
Congratulations, and thank you for your service to our country. You are a wealth of knowledge and information, and it has been my pleasure speaking with you today.
Well, Yvonne, thank you very much for having me on the program. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, and if you can check it out, the documentary is called America's Diplomats. Check it out. Ambassador Newman is featured along with many of his other fellow ambassadors as well. I'm Yvonne Greer. Thank you so much for being with us here on Consider This. We'll see you next time.